12 days after an emergency cesarean, a woman is barely surviving. My husband calculated this exact moment to strike, believing a bleeding, exhausted mother would obediently sign away everything. He and his wealthy mistress had prepared a victory feast on my ashes. They had no idea the woman walking into that negotiation room holding her newborn did not bring tears, but a death sentence for their empire of illusions. Hello to the wonderful audience of Violet Revenge Stories. We are deeply grateful for your continuous presence, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to keep the channel alive. If you enjoy our story today, please consider supporting us with just $1, which will give us the funds to pay our dedicated staff so they can afford their living expenses and keep creating these amazing stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code displayed on the screen, or by clicking the PayPal link located in the video description or the pinned comments. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. My name is Aria Crawford, and this is the story of my survival. Every single breath I took felt like shattered glass grinding inside my chest. It had been exactly 12 days since the emergency cesarean section that brought my daughter into the world. A horrific and bloody operation fraught with terrifying complications that had nearly cost both of us our lives. The deep surgical incision across my lower abdomen burned with a white-hot, sickening agony every time I shifted my weight, coughed, or even blinked too hard. My entire body was a broken battlefield, stitched together and heavily bruised, fighting a desperate, exhausting war for basic survival and healing, yet holding little Maya against my chest, feeling her tiny and fragile heartbeat thumping steadily against mine, made the suffocating physical torture somewhat bearable. We had just returned to our high-rise luxury apartment in Chicago exactly 3 days ago. I genuinely thought this place, with its sprawling, glittering views of the city skyline, would be our safe haven to recover. I was terribly, fatally wrong. The apartment was dead silent, save for the soft, rhythmic breathing of my sleeping newborn. I was sitting rigidly on the edge of the velvet living room sofa, struggling to adjust my posture without tearing my fresh stitches. When the heavy oak front door swung open, my husband, Miles Sterling, walked in. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not walk over to look at his newborn daughter. Instead, he marched straight toward the center of the room with a face carved from cold stone and tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto the glass table. The heavy thud echoed through the silent apartment like a judge striking a wooden gavel. "Sign them," he demanded, his voice completely devoid of any warmth, empathy, or hesitation. "I am not dragging this out. Aria, it is over." My exhausted, sleep-deprived brain struggled to process the harsh words. I stared blankly at the papers, then up at the man I had loved and supported fiercely for over 5 years. My trembling hands reached out to pull the manila folder closer. The bold black letters across the top page read, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." I forced my heavy, tear-filled eyes to read through the dense, suffocating legal jargon. The terms were not just unfair. They were financially lethal. Miles was demanding absolute 100% ownership of the newly founded tech startup we had supposedly built together from the ground up. More devastatingly, the documents explicitly shifted the entirety of our massive joint credit card debts, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, squarely onto my name. He wanted to walk away with the golden goose and leave me drowning in the toxic waste of the massive financial risks he had taken. "Miles, what is this?" I whispered, my throat dry and aching with betrayal. "We have a 12-day-old baby. I am still bleeding through my bandages. You cannot just saddle me with all the corporate debt and take the entire company." He let out a short, hollow laugh, casually adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit. "I can. And I will. Read the next page. Aria, if you decide to fight me on the assets, I will immediately file for full, sole custody of Maya." My heart stopped dead in my chest. My arms instinctively tightened around the sleeping infant in my lap, shielding her, You cannot do that. You have barely held her since she was born. The courts will see it very differently, Miles sneered, leaning closer, his eyes cold, calculating, and full of malice. You are clearly unstable. You just had a traumatic surgery. You are exhibiting severe signs of postpartum depression, and your mental state is entirely unreliable. My lawyers will paint you as an unfit, hysterical mother who cannot even care for herself, let alone a newborn infant. Sign the papers, take the debt, and I will graciously let you keep the kid. Fight me, and I will make sure you never see her again. Blind panic clawed at my throat. As soon as he turned his back and left the apartment to meet his lawyers, I placed Maya gently in her secure bassinet. Ignoring the excruciating pain shooting through my torn abdomen, I dragged myself across the room to my laptop. I needed to hire the most ruthless divorce attorney in Chicago immediately. I quickly logged into our joint banking portal to access our family savings account, intending to pull out the $50,000 we had diligently saved for emergencies. The screen loaded slowly. The balance stared back at me, mocking my desperation. $0 My hands shook violently as I pulled up the detailed transaction history. Going back over 6 months, Miles had been systematically and quietly draining the accounts. A few $1,000s here, $10,000 there, all transferred out to offshore holdings and private accounts I could not trace. He had planned this execution perfectly. He had waited until my body was physically broken, until my mind was clouded with severe sleep deprivation, and until my bank accounts were entirely dry. He knew a standard family lawyer required a retainer of at least $10,000, money I no longer possessed. He wanted to paralyze me completely. For a long, agonizing hour, I sat alone in the dim light of the living room as tears of absolute despair threatened to spill over. The physical agony radiating from my surgical wound blended with the crushing psychological shock of his ultimate betrayal, creating a dark storm of suffering that should have broken me completely. Any normal, exhausted wife would have picked up the pen and signed away her entire future just to escape the nightmare and find a tiny sliver of peace. But the tears never fell. Instead of collapsing into the dark, hopeless abyss Miles had meticulously dug for me, something deep inside my mind shifted. The helpless, betrayed wife died right there in that cold Chicago apartment. In her place, the raw, primal maternal instinct to protect my offspring merged violently with the cold, calculating, and ruthless intellect of a woman who built digital empires from scratch. Miles had forgotten one crucial detail in his arrogant master plan. I was not just a naive housewife he could toss aside. I was the lead systems architect at Ethelgard Tech Dynamics. I spent my days constructing, dismantling, and securing the most complex data structures on the planet. I lived and breathed in logic, strategy, and unbreakable systems. Miles thought he had checkmated me by cutting off my funds and using my temporary physical weakness against me. He did not realize that by pushing me to the absolute edge of human endurance, he had awakened an apex predator. I slowly closed the laptop, a terrifying, icy calm washing over my battered body. I did not need an expensive family lawyer to destroy him. I just needed a keyboard. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a harsh neon green, displaying 3:15 in the morning. The city of Chicago was asleep, but inside my dark apartment, the only illumination came from the stark white glare of my terminal window. I sat rigidly in the corner of my home office, balancing my newborn daughter against my chest with my left arm, while my right hand commanded the keyboard. Sleep was a biological necessity I had to violently suppress. Every spare minute I could steal while Maya rested was a tactical window. I was no longer a victim weeping over a broken marriage. I was a digital forensic investigator standing at an active crime scene. Miles considered himself a visionary tech entrepreneur. Yet his understanding of network security was pathetically amateur. He had installed a commercial-grade router in our living room, masked it with a standard virtual private network, and left the administrative gateway practically wide open. For a lead systems architect who designed enterprise-level security infrastructures, penetrating his home network was barely a warm-up exercise. It took me exactly 9 minutes to bypass his firewall and establish a silent, undetectable proxy connection to his personal workstation. I maneuvered through his directories like a phantom. I initially went in searching for digital receipts, offshore bank routing numbers, or any trace of the family savings he had ruthlessly drained. Instead, I stumbled into an entirely separate, subterranean existence, hidden behind a dual authentication wall that I easily spoofed by cloning his device media access control address. I found a heavily encrypted private communications channel. I immediately routed a brute force decryption protocol through my secure workstation at the corporate office. The encryption key shattered in under 20 minutes. Thousands of hidden messages flooded my screen, organized meticulously into separate folders. The primary sender across 70% of the correspondence was a name that sent a shockwave of cold recognition through my veins. Sloan Mercer. Anyone operating within the Chicago tech sector recognized that name immediately. She was a predatory venture capitalist, a notorious financial shark famous for hostile takeovers and ruthlessly gutting vulnerable startups for rapid profit. As I opened the message threads dating back over 18 months, the sickening reality unspooled before my eyes. Sloan was not simply the primary angel investor bankrolling my husband's new corporate venture. She was his mistress. The emails were a nauseating, intertwined mess of aggressive financial strategy and graphic, explicit intimacy. They discussed reserving luxury penthouse suites in Paris and Dubai during the exact same weeks Miles had told me he was attending grueling developer conferences in Seattle. They exchanged mocking jokes about my dedication, laughing about how oblivious I was, grinding through 60-hour work weeks at my corporate job to pay our mortgage while he pretended to struggle with his startup. My stomach violently rebelled, but the cold, analytical center of my brain forced me to maintain my focus. I systematically downloaded every single thread, every photograph, and every financial ledger onto an encrypted external drive. Then, I breached a restricted directory labeled Project Genesis. I decrypted the attached compressed files, and the breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed violently against my bruised ribs. Thousands of lines of complex, elegant machine learning code populated my monitor. It was the proprietary neural network algorithm, the exact core product his startup was preparing to launch to the global market. I scrolled frantically through the digital architecture. My eyes rapidly scanned the unique syntax, the highly specific data handling protocols, and the custom loop structures. I recognized this code immediately. I knew it intimately because I had written every single line of it with my own 2 hands. For the past 2 years, during my weekends and late nights, I had painstakingly developed a revolutionary predictive analytics framework. I had shared the progress with Miles, trusting him completely, asking for his feedback as a sounding board for my ideas. He had systematically stolen it. He had quietly cloned my private repository, maliciously stripped away my digital signatures, altered the author tags, and presented the entire framework to Sloan Mercer as his own unparalleled genius. He was building a massive corporate empire standing squarely on the stolen foundation of my intellect. I pulled up the accompanying financial projections and legal drafts they had exchanged. The sheer scale of their ambition was staggering. They were not merely launching a standard tech product, they were aggressively preparing for an initial public offering. The internal documents detailed a strict timeline to take the company public within 8 months, projecting a conservative initial market valuation of at least $3 billion. They were plotting to become billionaires, their wealth entirely fueled by my sweat, my sleepless nights, and my brilliant engineering. My fingers trembled slightly, not from physical pain, but from sheer, unadulterated fury. As I opened the most recent email thread, it was sent just 48 hours ago, sent while I was still lying in a sterile hospital bed, bleeding and fighting an infection from a major surgery. Sloan had written to him outlining the legal strategy for our divorce. "You need to cut the dead weight right now. Miles," her message read, the black text glaring at me. "We absolutely cannot have her claiming any portion of the marital assets right before the public offering. Push the massive credit card debt onto her name. She's a bleeding liability right now, a weak postpartum mess. Break her down psychologically so she signs everything without a single fight, and we can finally secure the patent clean and clear. A bleeding liability, a weak postpartum mess. I read those specific words 4 times. The sharp, burning agony radiating from my fresh surgical wounds seemed to completely evaporate, instantly replaced by a searing, laser-focused rage. They truly thought my temporary physical vulnerability equated to permanent mental weakness. They arrogantly believed they could strip me of my life savings, steal my life's work, burden me with catastrophic financial ruin, and threaten to snatch away my daughter, all while drinking champagne and laughing in a luxury penthouse. I looked down at the tiny, fragile life resting in my lap. Maya's chest rose and fell in a peaceful, steady rhythm. I gently stroked her soft cheek with the back of my hand. I was no longer merely a betrayed wife filing for a simple, quiet separation. I was a master architect whose greatest masterpiece had been hijacked by a thief and a parasite. Sloan Mercer and Miles Sterling wanted to play a high-stakes, cutthroat game of corporate warfare. They wanted to steal my crown jewel and bury me in the dirt so they could shine. I closed the hidden inbox. I opened a blank command terminal and began writing a new, highly specialized script. My fingers dancing across the mechanical keys with deadly, silent precision. I made a solemn vow in the heavy silence of that room. I would not just divorce him. I was going to methodically dismantle his entire existence, brick by brick, line by line. I was going to let them build their $3 billion castle in the sky, and right when they stood at the absolute summit, breathing in their victory, I was going to detonate the foundation. I would bury them both under the rubble. The brutal reality of the American legal system is that a conventional war over marital assets heavily favors the party possessing the deepest pockets and the least amount of conscience. Any standard family attorney would advise me to file a temporary injunction to freeze his accounts, followed by a painful discovery process. But fighting Miles and his billionaire investor in domestic relations court would drag on for 3 to 5 agonizing years. It would require hundreds of billable hours, endless psychological evaluations, and a constant barrage of motions designed specifically to drain my non-existent energy and empty my pockets. They would weaponize my postpartum recovery, dragging my medical records into the public light to paint me as an unfit, hysterical mother. I refused to let them turn my life into a protracted legal circus. I had to bypass the traditional family court arena entirely and execute a surgical strike directly against the central nervous system of their corporate enterprise. When I initially engineered the machine learning architecture for what was supposed to be our joint venture, I hard-coded a highly obfuscated diagnostic gateway into the core logic. It was standard operating procedure for a lead developer, an invisible, encrypted bridge meant to allow me to remotely patch critical memory leaks without shutting down the entire user interface. Miles, for all his grandstanding as a tech visionary, possessed the coding literacy of a first-year undergraduate student. He had no idea this gateway existed. At precisely 2 a.m. on a Thursday, sitting in the blue glow of my monitor while my daughter slept soundly in the next room, I initiated the handshake protocol. My terminal pulsed silently as I bypassed the external security perimeters of his startup company. They were actively staging the final software build on their central production servers, preparing for a massive private showcase designed to lure in institutional investors before their public offering. I slipped inside their mainframe completely undetected, effectively becoming a ghost within the machine. I was not there to randomly destroy the digital infrastructure. Vandalism is an emotional response. I was operating purely on cold mathematical logic. I began meticulously weaving a deeply encrypted, recursive copyright watermark into the absolute foundation of the predictive algorithm. This was not a superficial author tag that could be easily deleted by a hired technician. I integrated the watermark directly into the core execution loops of the neural network. If anyone attempted to extract, alter, or override this specific block of code, the entire logic structure would instantly collapse, rendering the software utterly useless. Through this unalterable digital signature, I legally and permanently bound the entirety of the intellectual property rights to an irrevocable legal trust fund. The sole named beneficiary of this newly minted trust was Maya Sterling. To ensure absolute compliance, I required a definitive failsafe. Beneath the copyright integration, I embedded a dormant logic bomb. It was a digital kill switch, attaching its activation trigger to a heavily encrypted remote command line that only I possessed. Upon my specific execution, the script would automatically sever all primary database connections, override the administrator credentials, and permanently brick the entire global server network in less than 30 seconds. However, brilliant code alone could not finalize this execution. I needed a legal predator to spring the trap. Miles believed he had financially paralyzed me by draining our joint savings, but he vastly underestimated my capacity for compartmentalization. 7 years ago, long before I ever met him, I had established a high-yield offshore retirement portfolio. I had never merged it into our marital estate, and he had absolutely no idea it existed. The next morning, I authorized an emergency penalty withdrawal, liquidating exactly $95,000 in cash. By noon, I had wired an $80,000 retainer directly to one of the most ruthless intellectual property and federal cybercrime litigators in the state of Illinois. When I sat in his secure office and showed him the server logs, the stolen repositories, and the emails detailing federal financial fraud, my new attorney did not offer me sympathy. He offered me a merciless strategy. The architecture of my revenge was now fully constructed. I just needed to lure my targets into the execution chamber. I picked up my phone and drafted a text message to Miles. I deliberately used broken grammar, eliminated all capitalization, and adopted a tone of utter, crushing defeat. I am so tired, Miles. I cannot fight you anymore. My stitches are bleeding, and I just want to sleep. Tell me where to go to sign the papers so we can be done. His reply arrived exactly 2 minutes later, precise and devoid of any humanity. My legal team has scheduled a final mediation at their downtown office for next Tuesday at 10 in the morning. Bring the kid. Sit quietly, sign the documents, and do not make a scene. The smug, victorious tone radiated through the digital screen. Miles was fully intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. He genuinely believed his psychological warfare had utterly broken my spirit, reducing me to an obedient, terrified victim begging for scraps. He thought he had successfully cornered a wounded, helpless animal. He never realized he was happily walking into a reinforced steel cage, handing me the key and patiently waiting for me to lock the door firmly behind him. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime on the 84th floor of a monolithic skyscraper in downtown Chicago. I stepped into the sprawling, glass-walled reception area of one of the most ruthlessly expensive law firms in the state of Illinois. The thick, custom-woven carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as a paralegal escorted me down a long, sterile corridor lined with modern art and frosted glass. I was guided into a massive executive conference room overlooking the steel and concrete spine of the city. Secured tightly against my chest in a soft gray fabric carrier was my 12-day-old daughter. Maya was deeply asleep, her tiny breaths rising and falling against my collarbone, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently the youngest person to ever enter a high-stakes corporate slaughterhouse. I moved slowly, deliberately, every single step pulling agonizingly at the fresh, burning surgical staples holding my lower abdomen together. But I kept my spine rigidly straight, refusing to show even a flicker of the immense physical agony coursing through my veins. Miles was already seated at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table. He was flanked by 3 men in perfectly tailored charcoal suits, his elite legal strike team hired with the money he had stolen from my accounts. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, a portrait of relaxed, untouchable power, exuding an air of supreme, suffocating confidence. But the true source of his arrogance sat directly to his right. Sloan Mercer had actually shown up. She was officially present under the thin, laughable guise of acting as the chief investment advisor for the startup company. But her physical presence in this room was a deliberate, highly calculated psychological attack. She wore a pristine, stark white designer blazer that probably cost more than my first car. Her sharp features framed by flawlessly styled blonde hair. As I slowly pulled out a heavy chair across from them, Sloane did not even attempt to hide her disdain. She looked me up and down, her cold eyes raking over my pale, exhausted face, my loose, functional clothing, and the bulky baby carrier strapped to my chest. Her lips curled into a toxic, practiced smile of profound pity mixed with absolute, unfiltered contempt. She looked at me the way a queen might look at a diseased peasant begging at the gates of her castle. Miles did not offer a greeting. He did not ask about the grueling physical journey it took for me to travel here less than 2 weeks after a near-fatal surgery. Instead, he simply slid a dense stack of heavily embossed legal documents across the polished expanse of the table. The thick packet stopped directly in front of me, the crisp white pages glaring under the recessed lighting. "I am glad you finally decided to be reasonable, Arya," Miles said, his tone dripping with heavy, condescending authority. "This does not need to be an ugly process. We have drafted a highly comprehensive settlement agreement. It is clean, it is fast, and it is definitively the best possible outcome you are going to get in your current unstable condition. You sign the relinquishment of all corporate assets and accept the reallocation of the marital debt. And in return, I will entirely drop my petition for sole physical and legal custody of Maya. You get to walk away and focus on being a mother, which is clearly all your fragile system is capable of handling right now." Before I could even register a breath to respond, his lead attorney, a gray-haired bulldog of a man with cold, dead eyes, leaned forward and seamlessly took over the verbal assault. "Mrs. Sterling, we must be brutally honest about the stark reality of your situation," the lawyer began, his voice a low, threatening rumble specifically calibrated to intimidate and break down hostile witnesses. "If you choose to contest this very generous offer, my client is fully prepared to initiate a highly aggressive, scorched earth litigation strategy. We have comprehensively documented your severe postpartum emotional instability. We have secured sworn medical statements regarding the traumatic nature of your delivery and the resulting psychological toll it has taken on your cognitive functions. If you fight us, we will formally argue before a family court judge that you are entirely unfit to provide a stable, secure environment for a newborn child. We will drag your private mental health records into the public domain. We will bury you in endless forensic accounting audits and grueling depositions. A protracted legal battle will bankrupt you completely within 6 months. And at the bitter end of it, you will lose the child anyway. Sign the paper." Sloane shifted gracefully in her chair, casually crossing her legs and resting her sharp chin on her manicured hand. "Listen to the professionals. Arya," she chimed in, her voice smooth, musical, and utterly venomous. "You are utterly exhausted. You are clearly not thinking straight. Miles is offering you a very graceful, quiet exit from a world you do not belong in. Take the deal, go home, get some rest, and let the adults handle the heavy lifting. You are completely out of your depth here, and dragging this out will only embarrass you further." They waited eagerly for the explosion. They sat forward in their expensive leather chairs, their eyes locked intently onto my face, fully expecting me to burst into hysterical, uncontrollable tears. They wanted me to scream, to panic, to beg for mercy, or to angrily hurl the heavy silver pen across the room. They had meticulously engineered this entire high-pressure scenario to trigger a severe emotional breakdown, hoping to capture a desperate, unhinged reaction that their lawyers could immediately document and use to definitively prove my alleged mental instability. But I did absolutely nothing. I did not touch the silver pen resting beside the documents. I did not look down at the threatening legal clauses printed on the pristine white paper. I simply sat back in my chair, closed my eyes for a brief second to manage a sharp, breathtaking spike of pain radiating from my surgical incision, and then gently, methodically began to pat my sleeping daughter's back. The rhythmic, soft tapping of my hand against the fabric carrier echoed quietly in the massive, deadly silent room. My total silence hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. I let them sit in it. I let their empty threats dissolve slowly into the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere. The more I said nothing, the more the dynamic in the room began to subtly, strangely shift. The lead attorney frowned, subtly exchanging a confused, nervous glance with his junior partners. Miles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident smirk faltering just a fraction of an inch as he completely failed to elicit the desperate, fearful reaction he had banked his entire legal strategy upon. Sloane narrowed her eyes, the faux pity completely vanishing, instantly replaced by a flicker of genuine, fiery irritation at my blatant refusal to play the assigned role of the broken, subservient victim. They thought my silence was the terrified silence of absolute surrender. They thought they were watching a defeated, broken woman completely shutting down under the crushing, unavoidable weight of their immense power and wealth. They were absolutely blind to the terrifying reality sitting right across the table from them. I was not shutting down. I was a predator silently observing its prey, willingly allowing them to gorge themselves on their own bloated, toxic egos. I wanted them to feel entirely invincible. I wanted them to firmly believe they had completely won the war, because the higher they allowed their blind arrogance to lift them, the more catastrophic and fatal the velocity of their impending fall would be. I continued to gently rock my sleeping daughter, my face a hardened mask of cold, unreadable stone, patiently waiting for the precise, calculated second to strike. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room stretched for another 60 seconds. Miles let out a loud, theatrical sigh, his patience entirely depleted by my refusal to play the weeping victim. He tapped his index finger aggressively against the signature line of the thick settlement document. I finally stopped rocking Maya. I leaned forward, my movements slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the trembling fear they all desperately wanted to see. I reached out with my right hand. I did not pick up the heavy silver pen. Instead, I used the back of my knuckles to casually shove the pen off the polished mahogany table entirely. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull, pathetic thud. From the deep pocket of my oversized cardigan, I extracted a small, heavy, matte black flash drive. I placed it perfectly dead center on top of the pristine white pages of his divorce decree. Before Miles could even open his mouth to demand an explanation, the man sitting silently to my left finally made his presence known. Marcus, the ruthless federal litigation attorney I had secured with $80,000 of hidden retirement funds, calmly closed his leather-bound notebook. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, and locked eyes with Miles's lead counsel. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice slicing through the tense air like a finely sharpened blade, "we allowed you to finish your little presentation out of sheer professional courtesy. However, my client and I are not here today to negotiate a marital asset division. We are not here to discuss alimony, debt reallocation, or child custody. We are here to formally serve your client, Mr. Miles Sterling, along with his primary financial backer, Miss Sloane Mercer, with a comprehensive federal complaint." Marcus reached into his briefcase and slammed a massive 300-page bound dossier directly onto the table. The sheer weight of it made the crystal water glasses rattle. "We are officially filing charges for the grand larceny of proprietary intellectual property, multiple counts of federal wire fraud, and a conspiracy to commit securities fraud ahead of a planned public offering," Marcus announced loudly, his voice echoing off the glass walls. The smug, victorious smirk on Miles's face vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of utter confusion. The bulldog lead attorney across the table completely dropped his aggressive posture, his cold eyes suddenly darting down to the terrifyingly thick legal dossier. I did not let Marcus do all the talking. I reached over, pulled a thin folder from the top of the stack, and slid it directly across the table until it hit Miles's folded hands. "Open it, Miles," I commanded, my voice completely steady, radiating an icy, lethal authority that made him physically flinch. "Those are the raw system access logs. Page 4, paragraph 2. Look at it." He hesitated, his hands suddenly trembling, but he opened the folder. On the 14th of October, at exactly 2:00 and 47 minutes in the morning. I recited purely from memory, my eyes burning a hole straight through his skull. You accessed my private, encrypted local directory. You bypassed the primary biometric lock because you secretly recorded my keystrokes. It took you exactly 4 minutes and 22 seconds to initiate a mass data transfer. You copied 98,412 lines of proprietary machine learning code. You then transferred that exact data packet directly to a hidden external server hosted under a shell company registered in Delaware, a shell company wholly owned by Sloan Mercer. Sloan bolted upright from her chair, the legs screeching violently against the floor. Her face flushed a deep, ugly crimson, the composed, arrogant venture capitalist completely shattering. "This is an absolute bluff," she screamed, her voice cracking with high-pitched hysteria. She pointed a perfectly manicured, shaking finger directly at my face. "You are making this up. You are a desperate, lying lunatic. Our entire software architecture is protected by an uncrackable, decentralized blockchain encryption grid. You could not possibly have breached our security, and you definitely did not write the foundational logic. Miles built that neural network from the ground up." I looked up at her, my expression utterly flat, feeling a dark, twisted sense of satisfaction as she willingly orchestrated her own downfall in front of a room full of lawyers. "Sloan," I said softly, a razor-sharp edge hiding beneath my calm tone, "there is absolutely no blockchain encryption anywhere within a predictive logic loop framework. That is completely incompatible technology. You are violently throwing around technical buzzwords you read in a magazine to defend a system you do not even slightly comprehend. You just admitted, on the record, in front of 4 licensed attorneys, that you blindly invested millions of dollars into a product you fundamentally do not understand, based entirely on the word of a man who stole it from his bleeding wife." Her mouth opened and closed silently, her face draining of all color as the sheer, humiliating weight of her own ignorance crashed down upon her. She looked frantically at Miles for support, but Miles was no longer looking at her. Miles was staring down at the printed pages of the server logs. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He was an amateur, but he knew enough to recognize the digital footprints I had laid out in front of him. He saw the specific internal Internet Protocol addresses printed on the paper. He recognized the unique server naming conventions. The horrifying realization hit him like a freight train. He suddenly understood that I had not just hacked his personal computer. I had been wandering freely inside the deepest, most secure layers of his supposedly impenetrable corporate mainframe. "You were inside the production server," Miles whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "How did you get the internal routing keys? Those were completely isolated from the external network." "I built the network, Miles," I replied coldly. "You simply painted the walls and claimed you constructed the entire house." The shift in the room was instantaneous and catastrophic. Miles's legal team, previously a united, aggressive front ready to destroy me, suddenly fragmented. The lead attorney snatched the printed server logs out of Miles's hands. He rapidly scanned the highly detailed digital forensics, the irrefutable timestamps, and the explicitly documented data paths. He then flipped to the federal fraud statutes Marcus had clearly outlined in the complaint. A deep, highly contagious panic swept through the ranks of the defense. The 3 men in expensive suits leaned in together, whispering frantically. Their aggressive, condescending demeanor completely evaporated. They were seasoned corporate lawyers, and they possessed a terrifyingly clear understanding of federal law. They suddenly realized their client had not brought them in to casually bully a depressed postpartum housewife out of her fair share of a small business. Miles had weaponized their law firm to actively facilitate the theft of a $3 billion intellectual property asset and to defraud federal regulators ahead of a public stock offering. The lead attorney pushed his chair back, physically distancing himself from Miles as if my husband had suddenly contracted a highly lethal, infectious disease. He looked at Marcus, his face pale and serious. "Counsel," the bulldog attorney said, his voice entirely stripped of its previous arrogance, now tight with professional self-preservation. "We need to clearly state for the record that our firm had absolutely zero prior knowledge of these specific technical allegations or the origins of this source code. We were retained strictly for a standard domestic dissolution of marriage." They were jumping ship. The rats were violently abandoning the sinking vessel before the water even reached the deck. Miles looked around the room, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated terror, as he realized the impenetrable fortress of wealth and power he had built to destroy me was rapidly crumbling to dust. The room was already fracturing, but I was not entirely finished. I reached into the sleek leather messenger bag, resting at my feet, and pulled out my lightweight silver laptop. I set it gently on the polished mahogany table, right next to the damning system logs. I flipped the screen open. The machine instantly woke from its sleep state, the dark command terminal already actively waiting for my final input. Miles stared at the glowing screen, his eyes widening in a fresh wave of horror. "What are you doing?" he choked out, his voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. "I am taking back what belongs to my daughter," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering finality. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for exactly 1 second. Then, I typed a single, decisive command line and firmly pressed the Enter key. For a brief moment, nothing in the physical room changed, but miles away, inside the sterile, climate-controlled server farm hosting the entire infrastructure of his heavily hyped startup, a catastrophic chain reaction instantly initiated. The dormant logic bomb I had painstakingly embedded deep within the core architecture suddenly awoke. It rapidly executed its primary directive. It aggressively severed every single primary database connection, locked out all administrator privileges, and systematically wiped the routing tables. To make sure my message was delivered with absolute clarity, I quickly tapped a few more keys, forcibly overriding the wireless presentation network of the law firm. The massive 80-inch flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the conference room abruptly flickered to life. Everyone at the table violently jumped, their heads snapping toward the glowing display. There was no corporate logo. There were no financial projections. There was only a solid black background displaying a stark, bright red legal notification written in bold, unyielding text. Warning: critical system failure. All foundational neural network architectures and machine learning algorithms contained within this server environment are the exclusive, legally bound intellectual property of the Maya Sterling Irrevocable Trust. Unauthorized access, replication, or commercial utilization is strictly prohibited by federal law. Before anyone could even process the words burning on the wall, the deafening silence of the room was violently shattered. Miles's customized smartphone, resting right next to his divorce documents, began to vibrate hysterically. An incoming call from his lead infrastructure engineer flashed on the screen. Half a second later, Sloane's diamond-encrusted phone erupted with a shrill ringtone. Then, the bulldog attorney's smartwatch began pinging relentlessly. Miles practically scrambled over his own hands to snatch his phone, his face a ghostly mask of pure terror. "Hello?" he shouted into the receiver. He listened for exactly 5 seconds. The blood drained so completely from his face that he looked physically dead. "What do you mean the servers are completely unresponsive? Reboot the backups. Use the physical failover switches." He paused, listening to the desperate voice on the other end. "What do you mean the backups are completely encrypted? Who locked us out?" "I did," I stated calmly, closing my laptop with a soft, definitive click. "Your entire global server system is currently a useless pile of expensive metal. Your company possesses absolutely zero functional code. The investor showcase you scheduled for tomorrow morning is completely dead. You have absolutely nothing left to sell." Sloane dropped her phone onto the table as if it had physically burned her. She stared at the red text on the massive screen, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The realization of her total destruction was finally taking hold. Marcus, my attorney, stood up taller, projecting his voice to ensure it dominated the chaos. In addition to the server lockdown, I want to clearly inform all parties present that precisely 1 hour ago, my office formally submitted the entire dossier of forensic evidence, including the internal communications regarding your planned initial public offering, directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. By this time tomorrow, they will officially freeze all associated capital assets. Miss Mercer, your entire investment fund is about to be placed under a massive federal microscope for actively financing a fraudulent enterprise. That was the final, fatal blow. The 3 defense attorneys did not even bother to consult their client. The lead bulldog snapped his briefcase shut with a loud, aggressive clack. He looked directly at Miles with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional disgust. "Mr. Sterling," the attorney barked, his voice completely stripped of any former politeness. "As of this exact second, our firm is officially terminating our representation of you in all legal matters. You actively lied to us. You submitted fraudulent financial affidavits, and you attempted to use our offices to facilitate a massive federal crime. You will receive our final bill by the end of the day. Do not ever attempt to contact me or my partners again." Without waiting for a response, the 3 men in expensive suits turned on their heels and practically sprinted out of the glass doors, abandoning Miles entirely to the wolves. Sloane let out a guttural, terrifying scream of pure rage. The pristine, untouchable venture capitalist completely snapped. She lunged across the space separating her from Miles, her hands swinging through the air with violent force. The slap echoed through the massive room like a gunshot. Miles stumbled sideways, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, entirely too stunned to even defend himself. "You completely useless, incompetent fraud!" Sloane shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. Her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "I gave you $30 million. I staked my entire professional reputation on this launch. You swore to me you built that algorithm. I am going to completely ruin you. I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a federal prison cell." She turned her furious, wild eyes toward me, perhaps wanting to scream at me as well, but she stopped dead. I was simply staring back at her, completely unbothered, my face radiating a chilling, absolute calm. She realized in that crushing moment that I possessed all the cards, all the proof, and all the power. She grabbed her expensive designer bag and stormed out of the room, leaving a trail of shattered arrogance in her wake. Miles was finally completely alone. The arrogant, untouchable tech executive was gone. He slowly slid out of his heavy leather chair and dropped directly onto his knees on the carpeted floor. Tears of genuine, pathetic panic streamed down his face. "Arya, please," he openly sobbed, his hands reaching out toward me, begging like a desperate child. "Please, I am so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Do not do this. Do not send me to prison. I will give you everything. I will give you the house, all the money, full custody of Maya. Just give me the decryption keys and withdraw the federal complaint. Please, Arya, I am begging you." I looked down at the man kneeling in front of me. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no pity. The emotional tether that had once connected me to him was completely severed, burned away by the fires of his own staggering betrayal. I stood up slowly, carefully supporting Maya's weight against my chest. The physical pain in my surgical incision was still there, a dull ache reminding me of the battle I had fought, but it was completely eclipsed by a soaring, overwhelming sense of absolute liberation. "You wanted me to sign everything away." "Miles," I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady. "I just did. I signed away your future." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on his pathetic sobbing and walked out of the conference room. My posture was perfectly straight, my head held high. Over the next few months, the federal investigation would completely dismantle his life. I would secure a massive, multi-million-dollar settlement from Sloan's panicked legal team just to keep my daughter's trust fund completely out of their disastrous bankruptcy proceedings. I walked into the bright, sunlit corridor of the 84th floor, holding my beautiful, sleeping daughter close to my heart. The suffocating darkness of the past was officially dead, and as the elevator doors closed softly in front of me, I finally breathed in the crisp, clean air of my new, beautifully free life. Thank you so much to all our wonderful listeners for tuning in to the conclusion of this story. We would love to know where you are listening from today. So please let us know in the comments. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us keep this channel alive. By donating just $1 through scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comments, you provide our dedicated staff with the means to support their families and continue creating these incredible stories for you. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next video.